ready to make a move.
Ready to make a move.
We're gonna have some.
We're going to go ahead and get started. It's time for us to do that, so we're going to go ahead and do that. As always, I tell people the first time that you've done this, just a reminder that we are recording, and you can hear audio, but you can only see me. You don't see anybody else, so nobody has to worry about being on camera or make sure their hair looks good or anything else. So it's just me. I'm the only one that's on the camera. And we're going to do this book of Exodus. If you remember, or you may not remember, but last year at the beginning of the year, I did Genesis for several weeks, and then I decided, well, the first year this year I'll just do Exodus. We'll just keep kind of going through a book. As I look ahead, thinking about next year, I'm thinking I'm not sure I want to do. I want to go book at a time for that many weeks in some of these other books, but the next part of this, the Old Testament, but we'll see. So we're going to do that. So let me pray, and then we'll kind of jump into it. God, we thank you for a chance to be back together on Wednesdays, for what it means to look at your Word. And as we open it, may we better understand who you are and who you called us to be as your disciples. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right. So we're going to talk about the book of Exodus, and I want to go over kind of the schedule for this study. And again, we'll do this, and it is the same study at 11 a.m. and 6 p.m. We stay on the same schedule, so if there's a week when your schedule doesn't line up, you have a doctor's appointment or a hot date or something like that, and you want to go, just know that we'll be doing 11. For those of us here, you'll get one of those guys every week. I did not get the whole section done. So you'll get one of those every week when you come in. That's the way we'll follow along, and there's attention. And there's places you can fill out things if you like to fill out stuff, and follow along with how we talk about it. I think it will all be on the thing. I want to go over the schedule for the time we're going to do this. So today we're going to do this first week, and we're going to do the big question and the big idea of Exodus. That's kind of what we're going to talk about today as we kind of introduce Exodus and what it means. Then we're going to talk about plagues and the actual Exodus, the leaving of Egypt and what that means. We're going to talk then the next week about leadership in the wilderness. On the 29th, that Wednesday, we're going to have a week off. I'm going to be out of town that week, and so we're not going to have a study either day or an online option for that day. Just so you know, you'll have a week off. It's the week before my birthday. Not that this is why we're traveling. We're traveling actually. We're going somewhere because my wife just graduated, and she wants to take a trip has always wanted to take a trip after graduating because she kind of spent her Saturdays and Sundays for the past 3.5 years kind of studying, and so she kind of said, I want to get away. So that was the best time for us to do it, and so we'll be gone that week. So I won't be here for that. We'll still have the meal on Wednesday nights, and we'll do all that stuff, and Rebecca's study that she does on Wednesday nights will be there, but we won't have an 11 o'clock study. Then we'll do the 10 and the other laws, looking at the 10 Commandments. The next week back after that, we'll do the rebellion and restoration, what it means to God, what that means. And we'll talk about building the tabernacle and what it was like, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. And the wrap it up kind of time is there for you to know kind of. It's just an extra week in case I don't know that I'll be able to get through as much as I think I'm going to be able to get through each week. But we'll do that. As always, if you have questions, don't hesitate to interrupt me. Hey, wait, say that again, or what do you mean by that, or whatever it might be, and we'll kind of look at that together and see what we might do. The text, the actual content of the text is not in your study guide, so there are Bibles available at the back of the room, and if you're online, I would encourage you to have a Bible handy for you when we do this, and then you will be able to do that. That's the Common English Bible is what's back there, which is a more modern translation, but it's kind of in an easily understandable kind of way. It's one of the books that the United Methodist Church recommends, one of the translations, and so that's back there and what we'll use. But so if it sounds different than maybe what you have, just know that's kind of why that is. So we're going to look at the big question this week and the big idea of Exodus. We're really talking about kind of the first couple of chapters of the book of Exodus. We're actually going to talk about beforehand and then kind of get us started with Exodus before we actually get into the meat of the questions or the ideas of Exodus. So the big question for us whenever we look at a book like Exodus or any other book in the Bible is the question of history. Questions like, well, what actually happened? And that's going to be the bulk of our study week after week. We're kind of going to look at what happened, and we'll discuss what that means. And we'll even do a little of that today as we get started. We'll look at we always want to know, when did it happen? You know, where do we set this book in the course of history? And then did any of it really happen? Or is it just a story? And that's kind of something else we want to know a lot of times. So I guess what I'm saying is that when we think of a book like Exodus, we often think of historical questions about the events that the book talks about. And that's okay. It's an important thing for us to do. Knowing questions, the answers to questions like when, helps us understand some of the questions like why was it written and why was it written the way it was. So let's look at when Exodus was written. All right, let's look at when Exodus was written. Let me go back because that's a little early. When Exodus was written. The truth is that no one really knows. I'm sorry I can't give you a hard and fast answer. No one really knows the answer to that. There are some traditions and then some struggles with that. So traditionally, Moses wrote Exodus between the 15th and the 13th centuries BC. That first date is based on a literal reading of 1 Kings 6:1. That 1 Kings 6:1, which says this: in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. So if that's the date, if we take that verse right there and take it very literal, it places the building of the temple at around 966 BC. 966. That would be 480 years after the Exodus. So that places the Exodus at about 1446 BC. So that's kind of where we are. So that's kind of the date. Now there is some difficulty over the date. And the first part of that difficulty is that it's numbers in the Bible are very rarely literal. They're very often symbolic. They mean something different than just what they do on the surface. So 480 years, literally rather than symbolically, is kind of an assumption we make there. But it's really kind of more symbolically probably. They're often exaggerated. So let's look at the 480 thing. So Moses, if we take it all literal, is 80 years old at the Exodus, and then 120 years at his death. Jewish tradition says that he was 40 when he fled Egypt. So that means that tradition divides Moses' life into neatly little 40-year kind of timelines. The Israelites also spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. 40 is kind of a go-to number of completion. It's a right period of the time. 12 is another number of completion. 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 disciples. I mean, I think that was a little number, but 12 anyway is a perfect number. So 480 is 12 times 40. So it's a completely perfect number. So that also gives the number kind of a sacred value as well as a numeric value. And I think that's probably more the intent of the dating of this than it is anything else. It gives it kind of a sacred value rather than just a thing. So there's a literal and symbolic thing. There's also an archaeology kind of side of this. So 40 years after the Exodus, after the wilderness, Moses dies. Another 40, right? And Joshua assumes leadership. We'll talk about that. This is the first thing. Shortly thereafter, they defeated Canaan and entered the Promised Land. It's all described in the book of Joshua in the Old Testament. And all that seemed to happen in the 13th century BC. That, along with archaeological evidence, would mean that there's a gap of about 250 to 300 years between the traditional date of the Exodus and the conquest. So that doesn't work out. There's 250 to 300 years. Just kind of gives us a struggle for how we can date this accurately. It doesn't. Also, in 19 1896, archaeologists found this kind of thing. There's a kind of depiction of it, a picture of it. It's actually 10 foot high, and it's an Egyptian monument. It's called Merneptah Stele. I'm sure there's a fancier way to say it, but that's a Merneptah Stele. And it's called that because it describes the military conquests of the Pharaoh Merneptah, including what he did in Canaan. And it was carved around 1208 BC. Now, we know that archaeologists can not only dig this stuff up and learn to decipher it, but they can also date a lot of this stuff. So that kind of, we're there. And it mentions Israel by name and this thing. So scholars argue a lot of things about it, but basically it names a group of people called the Israelites around Canaan around 1208 BC. Now, this is a lot of numbers, but this is important just to kind of place us in time. Therefore, the 13th century would be the earliest possible date. And most scholars say this is just way too early for us to do that. The other thing about it is, the other thing that's there is that there's a character study that goes along with this too. And we look at this thing and we know tradition says that Moses wrote all of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, but probably not really accurate. He is the main character in the book of Exodus, through the book of Deuteronomy, really. And this story is written about him. It's always written in the third person. And unless he's Bob Dole, y'all don't remember that, right? It's probably not. It describes his death. It describes very kind of, you don't write about your own death. Unless you're really kind of narcissistic, you don't write about that. Describe that, how that's going to happen. But he did, and it's just kind of we don't think he wrote it. It's written about Moses, and so it's in the tradition of Moses, and so that's kind of what it is. Most people that in the Bible that write books of the Bible, Paul and even other things, they often would tell the stories, and someone else would write down, or they would recite this and narrate it, and someone else would write some of it. And so sometimes some of the books that we think are written by certain people were probably written in the spirit of Moses, but not by Moses himself. So there's a little bit of a look at the literal or symbolic kind of way, some archaeology behind it, and also a character study that kind of gives us an idea about the thing. So did any of it really happen? And if we struggle with a date and how that works, did any of it really happen? Well, when you read Exodus, it's not the easiest story in the world to accept just at face value. I mean, there's water that turns into blood. There's the sea splitting in half. There's a talking bush. I mean, just normal everyday stuff, right? I mean, we had that that's a Tuesday, right? Exodus gives us staffs turning into snakes and then back again, swarms of frogs, gnats, flies, locusts, all kinds of stuff like that. The blotting out of the sun, an avenging angel swooping down and killing the firstborn if there's no lamb's blood on the door. I mean, all this kind of stuff is really kind of dramatic. And it's kind of one of those things that's difficult for a lot of people to read at face value and just say, yes, that's exactly what happened. But the faith side of things for me comes down to this. It absolutely could have happened. God could have absolutely done this. And I don't struggle with that at all. I do not have a problem saying that at all. But for me, what I always say when we talked about Genesis and creation and all the things that happened there. With the Exodus, the same thing is true. For me, some people say, well, if I can't prove it historically, then I can't believe it. The true nature of the story of the Exodus is that it tells us something about who God is. And that's the most important part of the story. That it tells us who God is and how God relates to God's people. Regardless of the provable historicity of the story and the facts of the nature, the fact that it says what it says about who God is and who God's people are is the most important part. And it says some very specific things about God. And those are the lessons we need to learn from the story of Exodus. So I'm not going to argue that it did happen. I'm not going to argue that it didn't happen, because for me, that's not the most important part of the story. I think it's more important to argue what it says about the people of God and who our God is. And the reason I say that in all of these Old Testament kind of stories and everything else is that I think it's become a struggle for a lot of people, and it's kind of become for some people it's a hill that I'm worth dying on, and I'm going to say, yeah, absolutely, it happened just the way it is, and that causes people to really struggle with their faith because they've taken history classes, they've read history books, they've done all this stuff, and it really is kind of a struggle. And so rather than make you decide, yes, it happened, no, it didn't happen, I think more important is to decide that who it says God is. So that's how we'll address Exodus. We'll refer to it sometimes, and we'll talk about it. We'll talk about some of the struggles with some of the things they say about whether it's real or not real. But it's not the most important part of the story for me. Now, there are historical roots. There were slaves freed from Egypt. There's stories of people moving into a land and all the other things that we'll talk about. That's a part of the thing. The fact that Israel's national story starts with the shame of being slaves suggests that it really happened, because if not, why in the world would you start your story that way, right? Most scholars believe that it's written from kind of a historical memory. One of my favorite stories growing up, because my dad's family was from New England, and everywhere, when you go up there, everywhere you go, there's a historical marker every 50 feet, because something in the American Revolution happened there. And I used to love stories of the Minutemen. And I would read those when I was a kid, books. My parents bought me books about those, and I'd read those stories all the time. And most of them, there's a historical nature to these, but most of the stories that I read around there were probably not actual events. It's just told from a historical memory. It reminds us of what happened during that time. And so that's kind of what happened here. There isn't any necessarily outside evidence historically that Israel was in Egypt, but possibly this is because the Egyptians were kind of a little bit embarrassed by the fact that they had this slave population that just kind of left. They had to let leave. So that's it's an interesting kind of thing. So let's also look at the origins of the name Moses, because that's an important part of the story. What does that mean? Moses, or Moses, roughly translates to born of. So it's like we have the name Barabbas in the New Testament is son of the father. Simon Bar Jonah is the name for Simon, and it's Simon son of Jonah. And so Bar is how the Greek translation says son of. The name Mose really means kind of born of or son of, and often it's a part of names in Egyptian culture, like I'm gonna butcher these names. Thutmose, which is one of the pharaohs and one of the leaders, and Ahmose, which is one of the other ones. So Moses was probably a name given to him as a part of a larger part of his Egyptian upbringing, and it also, I think, gives some credence to the historical nature of the story. But again, regardless of its historical accuracy, the Exodus tells us an ancient story that answers some ancient questions. And none of what we discover about the stuff, the history behind Exodus, changes what it says about God. And again, that's where we'll kind of begin, and where we'll kind of talk about it from the most important part. So let's look at the big idea of Exodus. The Bible was not originally written in chapter and verse form. That was a much, much later, modern kind of really in the grand scheme of things, modern kind of addition to the things, so that our kind of analytical minds could make sense of it. And say, so I can say on Sunday morning, our scripture reading today comes from this chapter, this book, this chapter, this verse to this verse, because otherwise how we divide it up would get confusing. Some of it makes sense when we read our Bibles, and some of it doesn't make sense. Some of it's weird, the place that divides it, and somebody did it somewhere along the way, and it's just kind of stuck. But it was not originally written that way. I always say that I'm not a verse memorizer. People ask me, where does it say this, or in this chapter, in this verse, is it what is it? It says this, and I'm like, I can tell you the story behind what's going on in the Bible. I know that story well. I've studied it all my adult life, right? But I'm not a chapter and verse guy. If you ask me what it says in this book, this chapter, this verse, I'm probably not going to be able to tell you that. I've never been a chapter and verse guy. But I love to tell you the story behind it. So let's look at the big ideas that are kind of over there. The first big idea for Exodus is that God alone is worthy of Israel's worship. There's story after story of the ways in which they were tempted to kind of stray from this idea, and God kind of shows up in different ways and acts on behalf of a certain people, and therefore that God alone deserves to be worshipped. And some of the reasons why that for Judaism, the festivals and the feasts were centered around telling the story over and over again is a reminder that because of what this God has done, this God alone is worthy of being worshipped. The second part of it is kind of this idea of saving is creating. We can really look at how the story of the Exodus looks a lot like the story of creation. As we uncover what it means, there's the parting of the waters to create dry land, and that's a part of the creation story. When we look at the creation story in our study of Genesis, we did last year, we looked at how God was really kind of taking control of the chaos that was out there. And the story of the plagues that we'll look at kind of makes the same statement. God is taking control of the chaos that exists in the world, and so that's kind of there. So the idea here is that God is kind of still kind of in this creating business. Now he's gone from as we looked at even in the study of Genesis, he goes from creating all of creation to creating a people. And here in Exodus, he creates a nation, and does that in very, very continues to create that nation, and he kind of does it in an exciting way. The next idea there is that of God's mountain. Throughout the story of the Exodus, there seems to be this kind of idea of a mountain. Most of the time, we call it Mount Sinai, but sometimes they call it Mount Horeb. We think it's probably the same place. It probably has different names. This is the second important mountain. And then there's this mountain which they're headed to in the Exodus, which becomes the hill around Jerusalem and the mountain where the temple was ultimately built. This becomes an important part of the story. And so the mountain of God and the high place where God kind of is residing is important in the Exodus story. And then at the end of the story, we get into the tabernacle kind of idea, and then ultimately when they get into the promised land, and then ultimately when they build a temple and all that kind of stuff, the story kind of goes that God moves from high, out-of-the-way places to continue to move down into the midst of the people. In the story of the tabernacle, we'll discover that God moved from... The tabernacle was originally, as we will look at it, was originally constructed away from the place where the people lived, outside of that area. But as the story kind of continues, it moves closer and closer and closer to the midst of the people. And that's a story about how God is moving closer to us. And of course, we as Christians believe that ultimately that happens in Jesus, right? So that there's this part of the story of God's mountain, which becomes important. The fourth big idea is that God gives a lot of commands. In fact, that's why I said the next couple of Januaries, I'm not sure if I'm going to start with a full month of study of Leviticus, because that seems like, I don't know if anybody would show up for that study, right? That's just kind of that's a rough book to go. I know you would. I know one person who would show up for that study for sure, right? But yeah, I mean, I think it's just kind of so we may do a kind kind of a group of them together because I have to look at that. But it's just interesting to kind of look at that. But God gives a lot of commands. If anyone's read through the Bible, that seems to be kind of an obvious thing. We'll talk about questions like, well, what happens if your neighbor's ox does something or falls into a ditch? Or there's all kinds of rules and laws that come with that. It seems that this will be important for the Israelites. That really the story is about how they're figuring out how to live as the people of God. And they get real practical about lots of stuff, as we'll talk about God giving lots of commands. The fifth kind of idea here is that we like to complain. In case you weren't aware of that, as a person in your own way or with other people you deal with, we like to complain a lot. We seem to like to complain against God and Moses, our leader, about lots of things. It seems strange for people who talk about how much God has done for them in the Exodus story, and that you think they want to do what God asked them to do, but not so much. They struggle with that. And we kind of understand that. We get that too. We do that. So these are the big ideas of Exodus, these 5 things. That God alone is worthy of Israel's worship, that saving is creating, that God is continuing to do the work of creating all that is, that there's a lot of things happening around God's mountain, that God gives lots of commands, and that we like to complain. And we'll look through the story of Exodus and what happened in that story, and we'll kind of discover some of those big ideas. All right, so how we got here. That's the next part of it. How do we get here? Let's look at how we got to Egypt to begin with, which starts us. We have to start in Egypt to get to where we're looking at how we get there. So the story happens that if we go way back, we go back to Joseph and his brothers, where Joseph is really kind of daddy's favorite, and he does they don't like that, and so dad gives him this big fancy coat to wear, the coat of many colors, and he thinks he's in big stuff, and he tells his brothers these dreams about how they're going to bow down before him one day, and they get mad. And so they throw him in a well. They're going to leave him for dead. But then one or two of them kind of feel bad about that. So they end up selling him into slavery to a caravan, who take him to Egypt. And he ends up kind of finding favor with Pharaoh and getting to be kind of a position of leadership and kind of navigates through some dream interpretation, kind of all this happened kind of before we'll happen back in Genesis, but. To kind of get to a prominent leadership place, he helps them navigate the beginning of a famine in the land, and so that they're able to actually support the family. The Israelites come because they can come to Egypt and they have food to eat, and so at the time it's a real kind of a symbiotic relationship. It's a real positive thing for the Egyptians and for the Israelites. Well, what happens is that there became what happened in the story is that there's going to become a Pharaoh who doesn't know Joseph, doesn't know that story, doesn't remember that story, and things kind of change. But Exodus starts at the very beginning with these names of the Israelites who came to Egypt with Jacob, along with their households. So this is Joseph's family coming there, and they all kind of come, and they end up there. So it's Reuben and Simeon and Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The total number in Jacob's family was 70. So 70 members of this family come to live with Joseph in Egypt, and they're there. Joseph was already in Egypt. Eventually, Joseph and his brothers and everyone in his generation died, but the Israelites were fertile and became populous. They multiplied and grew dramatically, and they filled the whole land. So they begin to kind of grow in numbers. So let's look at the beginning of this. Kind of lays out the 12 tribes of Israel. And so we're going to look at these 12 tribes of Israel. There's Reuben. These are all named after the sons of Jacob. And you're going to look at this and go, well, Steve, that doesn't add up to 12. Well, there's reasons why it doesn't add up to 12. And 12 tribes, it's kind of there. But there are all these sons, and they kind of have to Reuben was named after Jacob's oldest son, born of Leah, his first wife. There was Simeon. This tribe was supposed to inherit blessings from Jacob and assume a lot of land, but the story kind of goes as we learn it that they did some violent things and terrible things, and they lost their birthright. Levi, these are the descendants of the third son of Jacob and Leah, and Levi becomes the tribe of the priests. They're the ones who kind of become that kind of go, and their land kind of ownership becomes interesting. There's Judah, the tribe of Judah, named after Jacob's son Judah. This was the tribe, the first to settle in Israel, and they're the southern part of it, and that whole kingdom would later become known as Judah. There's Issachar, named after Jacob's ninth son. Zebulun, the sixth son. Benjamin provided Israel with its first king. Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin, and that tribe was later kind of absorbed into the tribe of Judah. So that's kind of how some of this works. There's Dan, Naphtali, and Naphtali means to win through wrestling, which is, if you know the story of Jacob wrestling with God, that's kind of how that name came around. And so there's Gad, and Asher, named after another son, and then Joseph. Now, no tribe bore the name of Joseph. He didn't get a tribe named after him, but his sons, he had two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and those kind of had some leadership of tribes, and tribes named after them. So those are some names. I forgot to advance that slide. So there you go. Now, I want to let you look at a map with you. This map kind of shows kind of where they settled in the midst of everything else. You can kind of see kind of the tribes that got larger lands and smaller lands and all that kind of stuff, and how that worked in that area. And you'll see some of the other names there, like Jericho, and you'll see all these other names that you might recognize. Hebron, they're from other Bible stories. Beersheba, kind of there. All those names are there, and those are kind of part of the tribes of Israel. So they kind of, that's where the original nation of Israel was, and that's kind of how it settled. If I superimpose the modern day map of Israel over that, it would be very different, because part of that kingdom is no longer the same part of the kingdom of Israel. So we look at this map and we kind of see where they are and kind of what they've done. Now, there are also, as the story of Israel kind of goes, and these tribes, and this is kind of not an Exodus thing, but it's kind of going down the rest of the Old Testament. There became 10 lost tribes of Israel. They were exiled in the process of being defeated by other people and making agreements with other people. And so, like Reuben and Simeon and Dan and Naphtali and Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Manasseh, and Ephraim, all but Judah and Benjamin, which survived until much later, and also a part of the tribe of Levi. They all kind of came into the southern part of the kingdom and the northern part of the kingdom, and how it got divided. But these brothers kind of had their own land, and their descendants kind of had their own land, and they were one, but they were really divided. They never kind of, and there became, these brothers were kind of in this kind of group, and these other brothers were in this kind of group, and their descendants kind of became in that group, and it became kind of different. I always say a lot of the things that we seek to understand about how Middle Eastern culture kind of, some of the divisions that happen over there, one of the things that we don't quite always take into account is that some of the stuff that's happening in certain parts of the world are based on some sibling rivalries that have been going on since almost the very beginning of time. And so that kind of we don't take that into account some, because I don't know if you have a brother or a sister, but I have 3 stepbrothers. I have one biological sister, and we fought like crazy when we were growing up. My parents divorced. My mom got remarried right before my senior year of high school, and so I was there at home for a year, and then I went away to college. And my sister, when she went away to college, she came to the same college I went to. And I was like, "What are you doing? You don't even like being around me." And she goes, "Oh, I just want to be near my brother." And I was like, "What is going on?" And it was just kind of like this thing where we fought because we weren't on the same. But then once kind of the family we had step brothers and everything else, we kind of became a team for her, and we kind of family dynamics are weird in our current world, so they're very weird in the world that they do that. So it's just some of the stuff is important to look at the tribes, because the tribes all come from these brothers, and so the very beginning of Exodus lays out this process for how this is going to do, how this is going to happen. All right, so
how does Simeon get lumped into the 10 when it's not in the north? He clearly wasn't taken by Assyria.
He kind of lost his. He kind of got lost his kind of birthright, kind of through some actions and some partnerships that he made, and it got absorbed into some other stuff, and didn't act like a good brother, I guess, and some of the other people kind of, as I remember, kind of took that over. I'll do some more research. I can find out more about exactly how it happened, but you're right. I mean, that's just kind of weird. So, oops, what happened there? Did I lose some of my pages? All right. Well, anyway. All right. So let's look at the story of the Moses, the origin story. So if you look at Genesis, if you look at Exodus, and you start to read down the rest of chapter 1, you're going to start to see a story of how Moses came about. How Moses was. What we know about Moses, his life comes from this narrative of the Hebrew Bible. So in the very beginning of that story, in about starting after this listing of all the brothers, we start to get into kind of Moses' story. And Moses, according to the Hebrew Bible, was born in Egypt to Hebrew parents, Amram and Jochebed, in about the 14th or 13th century BCE. So that's kind of the tradition of which Moses was born, kind of there. Moses was born during a time when the Egyptian Pharaoh was worried that the Israelites were beginning too many, too populous. They were going to overtake the Egyptians if we don't weed out the population and keep these people down. We're going to do this. So he started to order that the firstborn, if there were a male child was born, that they have to be put to death. They couldn't be born. And he makes this arrangement with these Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. And if you read that story, you'll find that these two women are Hebrew midwives, which means they're helping all these Hebrew women give birth to these babies. And his order to them was, if it's a boy, kill it. Go in the river. If it's a girl, let it live. And I guess that's kind of how they was there. And that if you think about some of the other ways in the history when people have tried population control by allowing boys and girls to be born, it kind of goes the other way from what a lot of countries have done. But that's how that started with the Pharaoh. Shiphrah and Puah kind of did not want to do that, so they kind of said it didn't happen. And the Pharaoh kind of called him on the carpet for it. Said, "What's going on?" And they said, "Well, you don't understand. These Hebrew women are they're crazy. They give birth before we ever get there. I mean, they didn't, but they were not willing to do this. And so they allowed these boys to live, and so Pharaoh started to really kind of let his kind of legion kind of get out there and kind of take care of these young boys, and so Moses' mother and sister put Moses in a basket. You know that story, right? And sent him out into the Nile and floating there, and he gets adopted. So the next part of Moses' story is kind of the adoption. Moses was found by Pharaoh's daughter while bathing, and she'd wanted to have a kid and couldn't, and so she adopted this baby into the royal family. She gave him the name Moses, which comes from that Egyptian word being born of. The interesting thing about how that story develops is that she enlists his sister to kind of help out with this, and the sister says, "Well, I know this woman who would help you nurse this new baby," and it's Moses' mother who's doing this stuff, and all thing happens, and kind of they grow and how they do stuff. So then Moses, during his childhood, which is the next phase of Moses' life, Moses grows up in the Egyptian court, but he doesn't always feel at home there. He kind of keeps this sense of justice, and it gets him in trouble from time to time. And it gets him in real trouble one day when he sees an Egyptian kind of beating on an Israel slave. And he's incensed. He's mad as can be about this. And so he kills the Egyptian and buries his body in the sand. We're out in the desert. There's lots of sand. He buries the body in the sand. Maybe you've seen the movie with it, the cartoon or the other version, but he kind of done that, and so he kind of did that. So the next, after his childhood, he raised to do that. He flees. The next part of his journey is his flight. He flees to Midian after killing an Egyptian taskmaster for reading the Hebrew. He's trying to escape punishment. He knows he's going to get caught if he figures this out, and he flees to Midian, where he kind of runs into Jethro, who's a shepherd out there, and the priest of Midian, and out there doing all this stuff. And he takes him on as a shepherd in his flocks, and he offers him his daughter Zipporah, and to marry him, and Moses marries this daughter and lives as a shepherd for many, many years. We don't know how many years, but for many years, and so what happens in the story is this kind of develops, and Moses kind of does this stuff, and then what happens in the story is that Moses is out there kind of minding his own business, not thinking about his time back in Egypt, and God decides that God can use somebody who understood, have been raised in Egyptian culture, can understand that, and comes to Moses one day when he's up on the mountain watching his sheep and doing all the things he's supposed to do, and it appears to him in a burning bush. And then we get to the rest of Exodus. And then we get to the rest of the time when we get to talk about kind of what's going on and what happens and how and the rest of the story is how we're going to spend the next several weeks looking at exactly what's happening. So that's kind of the beginning of how the big idea at the big kind of beginning of Exodus and how we get started with this. And again, the history behind it is not our greatest concern, because it really kind of starts to teach us about who our God is, and that's where we'll kind of spend our time looking at this story. But for some of us, the history is really fascinating, and so I kind of spend some time studying it because I get wrapped up in it when I start reading through Exodus and thinking about it. And oh wow, how did this work? And so I will share that with you from time to time. If it's not interesting to you, then just tune out during that time and then tune back in when I get to the other stuff behind it. So, what questions do you have? The beginning of Exodus. A lot of information, right? It won't be this heady most of the time. I just have to get through this part of the story of Exodus, kind of to introduce it before I get in there. I'll do more with the text as we move forward.
How old was he when he left on his own and decided to go out and ended up with the shepherd? How was he? Well,
tradition says he was 40 years old.
40 at that time, not.
But I mean, again, that assumes that Moses' life was he was born and lived as a son of Pharaoh for 40 years, and then he left and went out and was there. And when he came back and led people through the Exodus, he was 80. So that's 40 more years. And then they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And then he died 40, led people at 120. And so, I mean, it kind of divides all this stuff up to neat little packages. And most of our life doesn't divide into neat little packages. And
So he had 40 years of growing up to see what was,
yes.
for impression was like. But in those days, 40 must have been like today, 100, I would assume. I mean, I can't believe the lifespan was.
Yeah, I don't think.
Assuming shorter.
Yeah, I don't think they measured time years wise. But again, I think years in the Bible, numbers at all in the Bible are always kind of more symbolic than they are literal. And sometimes if you get wrapped up into the literal side of the numbers, it really causes a lot of problems. They would tell the story of ages and numbers kind of to tell kind of some give some context, but also to kind of talk about how, so he would say he was 40 years old when he raised 40 years in Egypt. So that would be kind of like he was raised the perfect amount of time, a number of completeness, to be able to learn what he needed to learn before he, and then he's 40 years before he comes back. So he's at 40 years. Wow. So it's this number of completeness or wholeness more than it is. It could be 40, 80, 120. I don't know.
It takes some kids to their 40 to learn how to pray.
It does. I got a call from my 27-year-old preacher kid earlier today. Dad, my treasurer wants to know how much I have taken out of my check for my pension. I don't know how much you have taken out of your check for your pension. And he's like, well, how do I find that out? I said, well, you had to fill out a clergy compensation form at church conference. That all should be on there. And he's like, okay, I'll try to find that. I'm like, how do you not know that? I mean, I don't understand that. I mean, I know you think retirement is forever and a day away when you're 27 years old, but it comes quick. And so it's kind of, it's funny, you're right. It takes some kids it's a longer time to learn. How do you even know this stuff? So I think it also has the idea of this kind of number being symbolic of wholeness. Of he had the perfect amount of time to learn this stuff. So he knew what he needed to know. It's kind of more important than whether it was 40 years actual 365 day periods, 365 a quarter day period. I guess right. So, but it was it's just interesting. It's interesting to look at that and think about. Moses, and I found this image, it's like, we got this kind of these images of what kind of from Exodus. So I found that image. I'm gonna use that, and I don't know. We don't know how accurate that stuff is, but that's what we think of when we think of the movie. So that's how that works.
And it's what we think of when we think of Moses. We don't think about what he was doing before he ran off to be a shepherd.
Yeah.
Or what he did while he was a shepherd.
Right.
I mean, and yet that was a large part of his life.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And we know nothing about that.
No, I mean, it was just kind of like it's kind of becomes, kind of a. It's almost like people. I think the people that wrote it originally wrote even the Gospels. The people that don't tell us much about Jesus' early years. During his childhood growing up, they tell him when he's 30, which would have been the year that a rabbi would have kind of been on his own. I think people just kind of assume that you know this stuff because they don't have to tell you stuff. But again, I think it also is important to know that it doesn't really help us necessarily get to the point of the story about who God is.
Right.
By getting into the details of all this. It'd be interesting to people, some of us, about looking at that. But
we grew up with that phrase.
That's
the
right.
rest of the story.
That's right.
We want real completeness.
Yes, that's right. I want to know everything, but okay, well, and it's interesting because I have people say to me all the time, well, I can't believe you believe this stuff because this thing, starting out, you're getting nitpickier than I don't ever get with the text about things because I don't think that's the point of the story. You think that. Don't get wrapped up in that point of the story because it's not going to help you. So.
I think for them too, I know a lot of times, in my mind, everybody's childhood was just like mine.
Right.
And it wasn't. I mean, if I talk to people, their childhood wasn't. But in my mind, everybody is on the same thing. So why write about his childhood or his teenage years? Because everybody knows what kids and teenagers are like. You know,
Yeah,
that's
right,
not
right.
important to the story.
It's not. Well, it's not. But it's. It'd be interesting, but I don't think it's important to the story. Point of the story.
The mamas in us want to know, and the daddies. Did they lie to their mom? Did they steal a cookie out of the cookie jar?
And I always wondered with Moses. I always wondered, being adopted and being raised. I mean, what was the difference in the appearance of Israelite people and
Yeah.
and
When did
Egyptian
he
people?
know?
Did it become obvious that before it he kind of began to understand that that's who he was, or not, as he kind of grew and his face changed and his complexion is different or the same or whatever else, and did he? How some kids that are adopted, it's not a big deal, and other kids who are adopted, it becomes kind of a defining kind of event, and it's not always in the positive way. So how did Moses?
How did he?
How did he deal with it?
Yeah.
Was the Pharaoh's daughter kind of honest with Moses from the beginning about how she found him floating in a basket in the river and adopted him, or what? I mean,
My text said that she named him Moses because I drew him out of the
Yeah.
water.
Yeah.
But his name doesn't say what he's of.
right?
I mean, he just appeared.
Yeah. It doesn't
If
say.
you give him a
So
father,
did he have? Was there Moses something?
yeah. Did he have a father figure?
Yeah.
other
I mean,
than
yeah.
Pharaoh,
How did that work?
Pharaoh grandpa?
All that stuff is the trivia of all that stuff. I don't mean it's trivial. I mean, just the trivia of all that stuff is interesting, but we don't have those answers, so it's pure speculation on our part. So.
Yeah.
There's a lot of information, and the irony of it is that now we almost we go the opposite extreme. Much like with the stories in the Gospels of Jesus, we go from very little to no detail to kind of a lot of detail as we get into all this stuff. I mean, it's like, but even then, I mean, it's like the plagues. I kind of have this idea that the plagues happen like, all right, I'll do this on Tuesday, and then that didn't work, so I'll come back over the next plague on Wednesday. I mean, I don't think that's probably the way it went, but I mean, it's kind of all you always kind of envision it. So we get detail, but we don't get hard details. We'll look at it. It's fun. Well, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, and I look forward to seeing you all next Wednesday.
All right.